This video is on a theory called cultivation theory, and this is a foundational theory for all types of media. Probably you read a little bit about it in 611, and it was developed by George Gerbner, who was a sociologist who worked on something called the Cultural Indicators Project. And what Gerbner did was look at how violence portrayed in the media affected people in society. What Gerbner found out through his research was that in the United States, audiences overestimated the actual incidence of violence in the real world. And he said this was because 80% of television programs at the time, which was the late 1970s, contained acts of violence. Gerbner argued that our exposure to the media has long-term effects. And these effects are gradual, indirect, cumulative, and significant. What he means by these terms is that watching one television show that has violence in it isn't going to affect us or our kids one way or another, just that one exposure, but kind of the continual exposure to the images of violence, in particular, is what he was talking about, has a gradual effect on our perceptions of violence in the world. It's indirect in that we may not think that the violence is going to happen to us, but it's more of our greater worldview. It's cumulative, meaning each individual exposure adds on to the one that we just saw, and that increases our perception of the amount of violence, and it's significant in terms of how people see the world is significantly different than how it really is. One thing that cultivation theory found, for example, was that if you asked people what are the major occupations of people in the United States, they would say doctor, lawyer, and police officer, because those are the images that we see all the time on television, when in fact, they are not the three most dominant jobs in the United States. We really have two environments in our lives. We have the physical environment the desk we're sitting at, the house we live in, the street we walk down, and we have a symbolic environment. That's the ideas and meaning that surround us, just like this desk that I'm sitting at surrounds me. So the idea is that television and mediated content dominates our symbolic environment. And McQuail and Winhall, two researchers, said media are not a window on the world, but the world itself, arguing the symbolic environment can often dominate the physical environment. Cultivation theory says that there are really two levels of effects of cultivation: first order and second order. First order cultivation effects represents the relationship between television exposure and the quantitative estimates of frequency or probability of events in the social reality. So if we see everyone on television getting sick, we think that there's a good chance that we will get sick as well. Second order effects are the relationship between television exposure and value judgments or general attitudes about the state of the world at large. So if what this says is if you watch a lot of television, you're going to think the world is a more violent place. So the first order effects is whether we think something will happen to us, to me individually, and the second order effects is how we view the world. So you may be saying by this point, well, I'm a critical viewer of mediated content. I know what's right and what's wrong. I know when things that are shown to me are real and when they're not real. And researchers have also looked at this in terms of how our life experiences affect cultivation. And it's interesting because we have some kind of differences in opinion. One moderator that's been examined is called mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is the view that those whose life experiences are different from the televised world are more likely to be influenced by television reality. And this is because television reality will override the differences in perspectives from other factors and influences. So if our life isn't, if what we're seeing on television isn't familiar to us, if we've never lived in an urban area and we see urban areas portrayed as very crime ridden places on police television shows, as we usually do, we will, even though we may know that um, that there are safe places in urban areas, and most urban areas are really lovely and offer a lot of benefits. What we see on television will override what we might think is right just because we don't have that background in understanding what an urban area is like. At the same time, there are people who say, who look at a resonance as a moderator. And resonance is the view that if life experience of the viewer are similar to the world portrayed by television, then television will provide a double dose of the messages that will resonate and amplify cultivation effects. So, what this means is resonance says that viewers with more direct experience will be more affected by television viewing than those with less direct experience. So people who come on the resonance side say um, that cultivation works more if people are familiar with an urban area than the mainstreaming people. Um, Empirical evidence says that television showed a stronger relation to the estimates of crime among those with more direct experience with crime than those with less direct experience with crime. So there's more support for resonance than mainstreaming in some studies. The important thing, though, is that even though we have these life experiences that can help us critically look at mediated content and decide whether it's fiction, how fictional it is, or whether it does reflect the world, um, it oftentimes it doesn't matter. That we can often turn off our kind of critical perceptions of what television is showing to us and buy into the images and the ideas that mediated content presents to us. Another interesting aspect of cultivation is the idea of something called the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic says that the more easily people can retrieve information, such as a relevant example from their memory regarding a certain feature of social reality, the more prevalent or frequent they perceive the phenomenon to be. And then the ease of retrieving that information becomes a heuristic, a decision making rule that tends to inflate individuals' frequency and prevalence estimate of a phenomenon. So, for example, if you see a lot of drug advertisements for antidepressants, that will cause you to think that there are a lot of people in the world who are depressed, and it might even lead you to start to examine your own behavior and think about and think that you might be depressed and in need of a drug as well. So, mass media, of course, isn't the only information source that influence our perceived social realities. And in it, we're all embedded in different life patterns and contexts. And so all these things can present different sources of retrievable information and can influence perception of prevalence and risk of the things that we're seeing in mediated content. Sometimes this information attained through personal experiences is highly accessible, and we can add that into it as well. But at the same time, media can often overwhelm the knowledge obtained through real world interactions. So the bottom line is mediated content is really, really powerful. And in some cases, this can work to the benefit of society. So, one big positive effect of cultivation is the normalization of social relationships that may not be frequently experienced. So, when we see same sex couples or when we see mixed race couples in advertisements for big brands like Hilton, that can either confirm to us that a same sex couple is as appropriate a couple as um, a couple of that's a man and a woman, or if we have never experienced a relationship with a same sex couple, we can see that these are relationships that exist in the world and these can become normalized for us. So that's a huge positive effect of cultivation. And of course, there are negative effects of cultivation as well. If we only see a group portrayed in a certain way, we develop stereotypes of a group in terms of how those people act and belong in a society. And that can often limit that group's ability to achieve success and achieve what they want to achieve in the real world. And so that's why, after the Black Lives Matter movement picked up steam this past summer, we saw many brands rethinking some of their spokespeople that were continuing to hold on to stereotypes and think about changing them. So we know that Aunt Jemima pancakes, um, which had moved on from their slave imagery in the probably 1960s, 1970s, they believed that even though they were no longer presenting Aunt Jemima with iconography of a slave, they still felt that that was held on to by a lot of audiences, and so they made that good choice to change the name of the brand.